All right, this is part 2 of our growth and development chapter. This part of the lecture is going to go over pregnancy, the changes that occur during pregnancy, the stages of labor, the changes that occur after pregnancy, and then we'll have a short discussion over human genetics. So let's start with pregnancy. Pregnancy is going to be divided into trimesters. There are 3 of them. The first trimester includes the first 3 months of pregnancy, and this is going to be where the zygote becomes an embryo and then becomes an early fetus. The second trimester is months 4, 5, and 6 of the pregnancy, and it's going to include the growth of the fetus and expansion of maternal tissues, such as the uterus. The third trimester is months 7, 8, and 9. This is when the fetus is going to put on most of its weight, it's going to grow the most rapidly, and mom's body is going to start preparing for labor and delivery. All right, I wanted to show you this graphic again because I wanted to go over the definition of pregnancy. So I mentioned before that pregnancy is going to officially begin when the blastocyst implants into the uterine wall. That is the definition that since 1965, the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, or ACOG, has used. That definition is also used by other institutes, for example, Planned Parenthood, and by some textbooks as well. However, I want you to recognize that there are some other textbooks, some other organizations, and most politicians who are going to define pregnancy as beginning at the moment of fertilization. Even physicians themselves are torn between which is the better definition, pregnancy beginning at fertilization or pregnancy beginning at implantation. Okay, so just understand there's a little bit of controversy surrounding that definition. All right, but clinically, when we calculate pregnancy, what we're doing is we're calculating from the first day of the woman's last menstrual period. And this is because you can't exactly know when ovulation occurs. It's going to vary from woman to woman depending on what her ovarian cycle normally is. Okay, so we assume that ovulation is going to occur 2 weeks after the first day of the menstrual period. And so when we calculate pregnancy clinically, we're using the first day of the last menstrual period, and that calculates to about 40 weeks total time of pregnancy. However, those first 2 weeks are assumed to have been before ovulation. So from fertilization until birth, that time is about 38 weeks. All right, let's get into the hormonal changes of pregnancy. First, estrogen and progesterone. Remember, these are going to be produced by the corpus luteum during the first trimester, and then the placenta takes over their production in the second and third trimesters. High levels of estrogen and progesterone are going to suppress FSH and LH. And when you suppress FSH and LH, you're going to arrest the ovarian cycle. You're going to stop that ovarian cycle from going on, and you're going to stop ovulation from occurring. Estrogen and progesterone are going to facilitate uterine enlargement, breast enlargement, and fetal growth. Pregnant women are going to have faster growing nails and fuller hair because of these hormones. They're also going to experience relaxation of their ligamentous joints. I'll talk about that in a second. There's a hormone that does this as well. And then the uterus functional layer is going to grow due to progesterone. Relaxin, this is that hormone I just mentioned that along with estrogen and progesterone is going to help relax ligamentous structures. It is secreted by the corpus luteum and the placenta. And what it does is it promotes blood vessel growth in the uterus. It softens the cervix and the uterine ligaments, and this is going to allow the accompany the growing fetus, and it's going to relax places like the pubic symphysis. This allows for widening of the pelvis. during birth. Corticotropin releasing hormone, or CRH. This is going to be secreted from the placenta in large amounts, and it has a role in the timing of childbirth and the length of the pregnancy overall. It's also going to be responsible for an aldosterone rise in the mother, which promotes fluid retention and edema. Now, why does mom have fluid retention during pregnancy? Well, this is to increase her blood volume so that she can perfuse the placenta. Human placental lactogen, this is secreted from the placenta, and it's going to affect how the pregnant woman metabolizes her nutrients. For example, it's going to switch her to metabolize more fatty acids than glucose, and it's also going to make her insulin resistant. So the effects of insulin don't really work on her, so she has higher blood sugar levels, and this means there's more glucose available for the developing fetus. Prolactin, remember this is a hormone produced by the anterior pituitary, and it's going to ensure that lactation occurs after birth. Oxytocin, we see increased levels of this produced by the hypothalamus. Remember, it's going to be released from the posterior pituitary. And oxytocin plays a role in childbirth. It's involved in the uterine contractions necessary for birth. It's also going to be involved in milk ejection from those mammary glands. And you see an increase in oxytocin in the second and third trimesters in response to rising estrogen levels. Remember, oxytocin is also sometimes called the love hormone because it is involved in maternal bonding as well. All right, uterine and breast changes occur. The uterine is going to expand. It actually begins to enlarge once implantation occurs. By 12 weeks, the uterus is going to be just superior to the pubic symphysis, and this is going to impinge on the urinary bladder. And so you see more frequent urination, and you see this especially during the first and third trimesters. We'll talk about why the second trimester has less urinary frequency here in a second. Most of the uterine enlargement is going to be due to muscle hypertrophy, muscle hyperplasia, placental growth, and the amniotic fluid. By 16 weeks, the fundus of the uterus is going to be halfway between the pubic symphysis and the umbilicus. And then by week 22, it's going to reach the level of the umbilicus or the belly button, okay? And so because it's kind of extending upwards in the pregnant woman, it's going to temporarily decrease pressure on the urinary bladder. And I'll just kind of show you, see, we start off with the uterus down low, down kind of residing on where the, impinging on where the urinary bladder is. But then you can see the uterus, the fundus kind of comes up higher, and this is going to relieve some pressure on the bladder, at least temporarily. By the 9th month, the fundus is going to be at the xiphoid process of the sternum, and this is going to result in compression of those abdominal pelvic organs again. And so again, you're going to see impingement on the urinary bladder, and you're going to see urinary frequency. You may also see GI symptoms from all of the pressure that this causes on the GI tract. All right, breasts are going to be tender during the first trimester, and that's going to be due to those increasing levels of estrogen and progesterone. And then the placenta is going to secrete this hormone called melanocyte-stimulating hormone. And what it does is it stimulates the melanocytes to produce melanin. So this is going to darken parts of the skin, especially the areola and the nipples. It darkens the linea alba, which is like this fine white line that runs up the center of your abdomen. Now it's going to be called the linea nigra. And then it can also darken the malar eminences, or the cheeks. And this is a condition known as melasma. You'll also see growth of mammary glandular tissue, so you see the development of additional acini. And these additional acini are going to be the reason why you see breast enlargement during pregnancy. All right, here's examples of the linea nigra. So remember, this is normally a light line that runs up the center of the abdomen, and it darkens in pregnancy so that you can actually visibly see it. All right, the mother's also going to experience digestive system, nutrient, and metabolic changes. We've already talked about this one a little bit, the increased insulin resistance she's going to experience. This is not just due to human placental lactogen, but also due to increased levels of corticosteroids, estrogen, and progesterone. And this can actually lead to gestational diabetes. Then there's morning sickness. This is going to be experienced by many pregnant women, mainly in the first trimester. Recognize that it does not occur just in the morning, even though that is the name that we give it. Some people experience just a little bit of nausea. Others have very severe symptoms and develop this syndrome called hyperemesis gravidarum, or HG. And these patients are really sick. They cannot hold down anything, not even water. So they get very dehydrated, they get electrolyte imbalances, and often they have to be hospitalized to receive electrolytes and fluids. The cause of morning sickness is unknown. Some think maybe it's an adaptation that's kind of gone out of whack that is supposed to protect the fetus from toxins in food, or it may be due to the onset of pregnancy hormones like HCG. All right, a little bit about gestational diabetes mellitus. This is diabetes that is going to first develop during pregnancy. So this is not diabetic patients who become pregnant. This is diabetes that does not appear until the patient is pregnant. And what happens is you get increased insulin resistance and therefore high blood glucose levels in the mother. And we've already talked about why. Remember, this is going to be due to those hormones such as HPL, estrogen, progesterone, and cortisol. Symptoms are going to start appearing in the second trimester. And the big thing that we worry about, the big complication here, is going to be a risk of a larger baby than normal. This is called macrosomia. And this is going to increase mom's risk of undergoing a C-section, as well as birth complications, including hypoglycemia. And the reason for this is because all of that those high glucose levels, all of that glucose circulating in mom's blood is going to basically diffuse across the placenta and get into baby's bloodstream. And that high glucose level is going to tell baby's pancreas to make insulin, and insulin is going to tell the body to grow and store fat. And so baby gets big. Now when baby's born, baby still has a pancreas that's producing a lot of insulin, but you remove the baby from that high blood glucose stream that mom has been feeding it through the placenta. So now baby is outside of mom's body and has normal blood glucose levels, doesn't have any problem, doesn't have any insulin resistance on its own, but its pancreas is all jacked up, making a whole bunch of insulin. And so baby can experience drastic, life-threatening hypoglycemia. So you have to be ready for that. To treat gestational diabetes, we give a special diet to mom to help regulate her blood glucose levels. All right, abdominal complaints that can happen during pregnancy. So those high progesterone levels are going to result in relaxed, smooth muscle, and that's going to slow down the motility of the GI tract. Therefore, materials are going to remain in it for longer periods. Right? This can lead to things like gastroparesis, where the stomach does not empty the contents very quickly. And it can lead to things like constipation. Organ compression is also going to occur due to the expanding uterus. And this can result in things like heartburn or gastroesophageal reflux, as well as indigestion. And this can also cause constipation. And constipation, as well as that increased pressure on the venous system, in the abdomen and pelvis can lead to problems like hemorrhoids. Nutrition. So mom is going to experience weight gain due to, number one, the fetus, number two, the placenta, breast enlargement, and uterine enlargement. Number three, fluid retention. And number four, a gain in adipose tissue. As far as how much she needs to take in every day, she needs about 300 extra calories per day in order to support the pregnancy. And she's going to require adequate folic acid, calcium, protein, and iron. And this is so baby can make its cells properly, and also so that baby can direct its cells to organize in the proper fashion. For example, if you lack folic acid, you are at an increased risk of your baby having spina bifida. And that's where the spinal canal does not completely fuse like it should. So the cardiovascular system is going to undergo dramatic changes during pregnancy. More blood is going to be needed to distribute those respiratory gases and those nutrients between mom and the fetus. Mom's plasma volume is going to increase by 50%. Her cardiac output is going to increase by up to 50% as well. And heart rate and stroke volume are going to increase. She's going to experience changes in her blood pressure. It may initially increase during the first trimester, but it later drops, and this is due to decreased peripheral resistance. She experiences a lower blood viscosity due to that increased plasma volume, and she experiences a decreased sensitivity to angiotensin II. And she's going to be experiencing this decreased sensitivity to angiotensin II because remember, angiotensin II is a vasoconstrictor, and we don't want to constrict the blood vessels feeding the placenta. Okay, so decreasing sensitivity to angiotensin II is going to protect that placenta. She's also going to experience compression of those abdominal blood vessels by the growing fetus. And this can and usually does impair venous return from the lower body. And this can result in varicose veins, right? Because the blood is kind of backing up down in the legs, and that can damage the valves as well as the, the vessels themselves. It can result in hemorrhoids, as we discussed, and it can also result in edema, peripheral edema in the lower limbs. Let's talk a little bit about preeclampsia. This is a condition of high blood pressure that occurs by the second half of pregnancy. There are several risk factors for preeclampsia. The cause is unknown, but we think it has something to do with the placenta, the blood supply in the placenta, and perhaps it has poor perfusion, which results in endothelial cell injury. The only cure for preeclampsia is going to be giving birth and ultimately getting rid of that placenta, right? Patients with preeclampsia may be prescribed bed rest, medications, or they may go ahead and induce labor. Eclampsia. This is a condition of high blood pressure causing seizures in patients with preeclampsia, and this is a medical emergency. Untreated eclampsia can lead to the death of both the mother and the baby. Rapid treatment of seizures and rapid delivery is going to be the cure. All right, some of the respiratory changes that occur. First of all, the expanding uterus is going to press on that diaphragm and kind of prevent it from being able to fully descend and prevent those lungs from being able to fully expand, okay? So mom can experience dyspnea or difficulty breathing and shortness of breath. Progesterone. This is going to increase that brainstem sensitivity to CO2. Remember that the brainstem is monitoring CO2 levels primarily, and that is the main driving force for respiration, is how high is the CO2 in the blood. Well, if we increase sensitivity to CO2, that means lower levels of CO2 can stimulate the respiratory center to breathe. So that means mom's going to breathe faster. She's going to have a faster respiratory rate. And so this is going to lower her blood CO2 levels. And this is ultimately going to facilitate diffusion of gases across the placenta. Now, what this does really is this lowers mom's CO2 levels to below the fetus's CO2 levels, so that the fetus can have its CO2 diffuse away from it towards mom, and then mom can get rid of that CO2 by just breathing it off. Remember, the fetus can't breathe yet, so it can't get rid of its CO2. We're going to see an increase in tidal volume, an increase in pulmonary ventilation and respiratory rate, like we talked about, and therefore an increase in oxygen consumption. And this is going to help provide oxygen to the mother and ultimately to the fetus. Mom's urinary system is going to experience changes. Remember, the urinary system is going to be necessary to eliminate waste from not just mom, but also from the developing fetus. And it must filter now 50% more plasma volume than it's used to. So this means that the glomerular filtration rate is going to have to increase, and it increases 30 to 50%. We can see a dilation of ureters and the renal pelvis. And the ureters are sometimes going to be compressed by that expanding uterus. And so we see urinary tract infections more common in pregnant women. All right, now let's talk a little bit about labor. What is labor? Well, it's going to be the physical expulsion of the fetus and the placenta from the uterus. Typically, it occurs at 38 weeks for a full-term pregnancy. Not all uterine contractions are going to lead to true labor. Contractions occur as soon as the second trimester. They can be noticed. They're going to be weak and irregular at first, and become more intense and frequent as estrogen and oxytocin levels increase. Now, premature labor is going to be labor prior to 38 weeks. This is undesirable because, of course, the baby's body systems are not yet fully developed and not ready for birth. False labor. This is going to be uterine contractions that don't result in the 3 stages of labor. Braxton Hicks contractions are the name for these. They're irregularly spaced. They do not become more frequent as time goes on. They are relatively weak. They don't increase in intensity. Okay, normal, like true contractions that are going to lead to true labor are going to be regularly spaced and then become more and more frequent. So shorter time interval between each contraction, and they're going to become stronger as time goes on. Not Braxton Hicks contractions. They're going to be irregularly spaced and they're going to be weak. The pain in these contractions is going to be limited just to the lower abdomen and the pelvic region. And sometimes the pain even stops when the patient moves. And of course, Braxton Hicks contractions are not going to lead to changes in the cervix. That's something you see in true labor. All right, true labor. This is going to involve uterine contractions that increase in intensity, increase in regularity, and results in changes to the cervix. What happens here is the mother's hypothalamus is going to secrete increasing levels of oxytocin, while the fetus's hypothalamus does the same. Both sources of oxytocin are going to stimulate the placenta to secrete prostaglandins. Now, you may remember we've talked a little bit about prostaglandins. These guys are synthesized from a fatty acid from the phospholipid membrane of cells, and they kind of act like a hormone. And one of the things that they do is they stimulate uterine muscle contraction. They also soften and dilate the cervix. So that's going to be the opening of the uterus through which baby is going to have to pass. So you want that cervix to be nice and soft and really open, real dilated. Now, the combined maternal and fetal oxytocin is going to be what initiates true labor. All right, characteristics of true labor. Contractions are going to increase in frequency as time progresses. The contractions are going to increase in intensity. That is, they're going to become more painful as time progresses. That pain is going to radiate from the upper abdomen to the lower back, so it's not just going to be limited to the lower abdomen and the pelvic region. The pain is not going to get better with movement, unlike in Braxton Hicks. In Braxton Hicks, if the patient moves around a little bit, the pain gets better. Not true in true labor. And in true labor, you're going to see cervical dilation, and ultimately these contractions are going to expel the fetus and the placenta from the uterus. All right, let's talk a little bit about the positive feedback mechanism of labor. So remember, what did we say is going to initiate true labor? Well, it's going to be these increased levels of oxytocin, and that's going to cause the placenta to secrete prostaglandins, which results in uterine muscle contraction. Now, as the uterus contracts, it's going to push the fetus's head against the cervix, and this is going to stretch and dilate the cervix. And that's going to, there's receptors there that recognize that stretching. And they're going to send a signal to the hypothalamus. And the hypothalamus is going to secrete more oxytocin, which is going to stimulate the placenta to secrete even more prostaglandins, which is going to result in even more intense uterine contractions, which is going to result in even more stretching and dilation of the cervix by the fetus's head, and so on and so forth. And this signal is going to intensify until the fetus is expelled. And then when the fetus is expelled, that signal that was telling everything to go, that stretching and dilation of the cervix, that source is gone. So now you're not going to be making prostaglandins anymore. The uterus and the cervix are no longer going to be fully stretched, and you're going to see a drop of oxytocin levels, and labor is going to cease. All right, let's dive into the stages of true labor. There's going to be 3 stages: the dilation stage, the expulsion stage, and the placental stage. The first stage of labor is the dilation stage, and it's going to begin with the onset of those regular uterine contractions. It ends when the cervix is fully effaced or thinned and dilated to 10 centimeters. The dilation stage is going to be the longest of the 3 stages of labor, with the greatest variability. Nulliparous individuals, that is people who have not yet given birth before, are going to experience longer dilation stages, typically somewhere between 8 to 24 hours, sometimes even longer. Parous individuals who have given birth before typically have shorter dilation stages, usually somewhere in the range of 4 to 12 hours. Okay, what you see in the dilation stage is regularly spaced uterine contractions that increase in intensity and frequency as time progresses, and they are causing the baby's head to push against the cervix, which causes effacing and dilation of the cervix. And you also see rupture of the amniotic sac and release of that amniotic fluid. We call this when the water breaks, or breaking the water. Manually, these can be ruptured. The amniotic sac can be ruptured if necessary. All right, so here is baby in the uterus. Here is the placenta. Here is the cervix of the uterus. Remember, it's the part of the uterus that protrudes down into the vaginal canal. And you can see it's starting to open. It's partially dilated here. Baby's head is pushing down on the cervix, and this is going to thin and dilate the cervix. Over here we have later on in the dilation stage, you can see that the cervix is now fully dilated. It's completely open. Baby's head is just about ready to come out. Baby's about ready to be born. That brings us to the expulsion stage. This begins with the complete dilation of the cervix and ends with the expulsion of the fetus. Can take 30 minutes to several hours. Nulliparous women again are going to have a longer expulsion stage typically than women who have given birth before. The uterine contractions are going to help push the fetus through the vagina, the vaginal canal, and this is facilitated by bearing down. Remember that Valsalva maneuver where you exhale against a closed glottis, and that increases abdominal pressure. All right, at some point during the expulsion stage, crowning is going to occur, and crowning is when the very first part of the baby's calvarium or skull cap distends the vagina, and the head is going to come through, followed by the rest of the baby's body. Sometimes an episiotomy is necessary. This is where those perineal muscles are going to be cut to create a wider opening for the body of the baby to pass through. Then they suture these up after the baby has passed through the birth canal. At the end of the expulsion stage, the umbilical cord is going to be clamped and tied off. All right, this is what the expulsion stage looks like in a normally positioned baby. A normally positioned baby is going to be head down, right, bottom up towards mom's superior, and then face down as well. So baby's occiput is going to be against mom's ventral side, or towards mom's ventral side. All right, so here's crowning. You can see this is going to be the baby's calvarium coming through the vaginal orifice. This is the mons pubis here. Down here would be the anus. So when the baby is expelled, you can see here they are face down. Sometimes babies are rotated the other way and they are face up, and we call that a sunny side up baby. And then finally you reach the third stage of labor, of true labor, that is the placental stage. This is going to occur after the baby is expelled, and what's happening here is the uterus is continuing to contract, and this is going to compress uterine blood vessels and displace the placenta from the uterine wall. The placenta and the remaining fetal membranes are then going to be delivered, and this is called the afterbirth. Expulsion of these products is going to be completed within usually about 30 minutes, and they're going to be carefully examined to make sure that all components have been expelled. Complications like hemorrhage or infection, very serious complications, can occur if fragments of the placenta are left behind. All right, here is an example of the placental stage. You can see the placenta detaching, the umbilical cord coming through the birth canal. Never, ever, ever, ever pull on the umbilical cord. You could rip the placenta from the uterine wall, causing hemorrhage. You could also invert the uterus. Never pull on that umbilical cord. To stimulate the delivery of the afterbirth, many times what they'll do is they'll do uterine massage, so they gently massage the abdomen and pelvis here to stimulate those uterine contractions. Okay, fetal positioning. I said the normal position of the fetus is called the vertex position. So this is where the head is down and the face is toward the mother's sacrum. This is the ideal position to dilate the cervix and push the fetus through the vagina. However, sometimes babies can be born in other positions. For example, they can be born head down but face up towards mom's pubic symphysis, and we call that, remember, sunny side up babies. There's another more complicated term that OB-GYNs use that I can never remember it, so sunny side up works. They can also be born in the breech position, which is buttocks first, so head up, buttocks down, and this can really delay cervical dilation. Sometimes special maneuvers need to be used to try to reposition these malpositioned babies. Sometimes we have to use things like forceps or even a vacuum to help deliver the baby. But a lot of times what they do now is they just do a cesarean section. There's less risk to the baby usually with a C-section. And this is where the fetus is delivered through an abdominal incision. All right, let's talk a little bit about the postnatal changes of the newborn. So the respiratory changes in the, now we call the baby the neonate, okay, the newborn. This is the neonate is the fetus after being expelled from the uterus. And remember that fetal lungs are not fully inflated prior to birth. Now the neonate is going to take a breath within about 10 seconds of birth. And this is going to be caused by the CNS reacting to changes in the environment. And those lungs are going to inflate with the first breath. Now the neonate's surfactant is going to help keep the alveoli open. Remember, that's going to reduce surface tension in the alveoli and prevent them from collapsing in on themselves. Now, in babies that have been born earlier than 28 weeks of gestation, they're not going to have produced sufficient amounts of surfactant yet. So they may need ventilatory care. They may need artificial surfactant. Okay, so they're going to need some sort of support usually until their lungs mature. All right, circulatory changes in the neonate. So remember, prior to birth, blood is going to be shunted away from those non-functioning lungs through the foraminal valley, right, between the right atrium and the left atrium, and through the ductus arteriosus. Remember, that connects the pulmonary trunk to the aortic arch. So with the first breath, with baby's first breath, there's going to be a huge drop in pulmonary resistance and dilation of those pulmonary arteries. And this is going to decrease pressure on the right side of the heart. And now you're going to get pressure on the left side of the heart. The blood pressure there is going to be greater. Remember, prior to birth, pressure on the right side of the heart is greater because there's so much resistance in that pulmonary circuit. But when baby takes the first breath, those pulmonary arteries dilate and that resistance in the pulmonary circuit drops dramatically to where now there's less blood pressure on the right side of the heart. There's lower blood pressure there than on the left side of the heart. And this higher blood pressure on the left side of the heart, remember, is going to shut that foramen ovale closed. Let's talk about changes in mom after the delivery. So postpartum is going to be the first 6 weeks after giving birth, and mom's body is going to be undergoing a lot of changes. Many of the changes are going to be necessary in order to feed the neonate, and she's going to want to return to pre-pregnancy form and function. All right, estrogen and progesterone levels are going to plummet within a couple of days after birth. The uterine lining is no longer needed, so we don't need these guys around anymore. The loss of estrogen and progesterone, that sudden drop, is going to result in feelings of sadness and depression, and we call these the baby blues. These are totally normal to feel. The mother's hair is going to revert back to the regular hair loss cycle. And her chemoreceptors are going to become less sensitive to CO2 again due to lower progesterone. So her respiratory rate, her tidal volume, and overall pulmonary ventilation are going to return to normal pre-pregnancy levels. Corticotropin releasing hormone levels here are going to drop dramatically. They're going to become basically undetectable within a few hours after birth. And the reason here is because the placenta has been delivered, so there's no more source of CRH in the mother. Now, high levels of CRH during pregnancy, some studies have suggested, have been associated with postpartum depression, which is different than the baby blues. Postpartum depression is severe depression that needs treatment. And then remember that postpartum depression is a separate entity from postpartum psychosis. which can occur very, very rarely, but it does occur. And symptoms there are going to be symptoms of psychosis, so delusions, hallucinations, and sometimes those patients are a danger to themselves and others, and so they need immediate treatment. All right, fluid reduction for the mother. So remember, she gained a lot of fluid during pregnancy, and so this is going to need to be expelled somehow. The amniotic fluid is going to be expelled during labor. Then there's this stuff called lochia, and what it is it's going to be a portion of the blood volume as well as mucus and endometrial tissue that's going to be expelled via the vagina. Lochia is going to be heaviest the first 5 days after delivery, but it continues for several weeks. Fluid is also going to be lost through urination, so you're going to see a decline in that aldosterone because we have lost the CRH. So this is going to cause an overall drop in blood volume, and you see increased urination in the first 24 hours after birth. Sweating, profuse sweating is also common, which works to reduce fluid. Lactation, this is the production and release of breast milk from mammary glands. Colostrum, this is produced by mammary glands. This is produced during late pregnancy and the first few days after birth. This is a watery milk-like substance. It's not quite breast milk though. It has a lower concentration of fat than true breast milk, and it's going to be rich in IgA immunoglobulins, or mom's IgA antibodies. And so a baby is going to acquire passive immunity this way from mom. Colostrum also has a laxative effect, which helps to facilitate baby's first bowel movement. Baby's first bowel movement is going to be made up of this really sticky, yucky, tarry stuff called meconium. And so it's kind of hard to get that first bowel movement out, so colostrum helps with that. Okay, and then there's actual breast milk, okay, and this starts to be produced a few days postpartum. It has a higher fat content than colostrum, and it has essential fatty acids, enzymes to help aid in digestion, and immunoglobulins. Now, your book is probably going to say that breast milk is the optimal nutrition for an infant. One could argue that the optimal nutrition for an infant is whatever the infant can eat. Okay, so there might be medical reasons why mom cannot either produce breast milk or cannot give her breast milk to the infant. She may be on very important medications that would be dangerous to expose the infant to. And in this case, formula feeding, choosing a breast milk substitute, is a medical necessity. Okay, so just keep that in mind whenever you hear the argument that breast is best. Just remember that there are legitimate reasons not to breastfeed. All right, let's talk a little bit about prolactin's role in lactation. So remember, prolactin is going to be produced by the anterior pituitary, and it's responsible for milk production. Dopamine is going to inhibit the secretion of prolactin in both non-pregnant women and in men. Prolactin levels are going to be increased by high levels of estrogen, both of which are going to cause acinine proliferation and branching of lactiferous ducts in that mammary tissue. So this is responsible, prolactin is also responsible for preventing breast milk secretion until after birth. Then there's milk letdown. This is the release or the ejection of breast milk. And this involves a positive feedback mechanism. What happens here is the infant starts suckling, and with suckling, those mechanoreceptors in the breast are going to be stimulated, and they send signals to the hypothalamus. The hypothalamus then interprets those signals and starts producing oxytocin. So oxytocin is released by the posterior pituitary into the blood, where it goes on to target myoepithelial cells in that mammary tissue, specifically in the mammary acini. And so oxytocin causes these myoepithelial cells to contract, and this releases breast milk from the acini. As that milk is released, the infant is going to continue to suckle, and that's going to further stimulate those mechanoreceptors, which sends more signals to the hypothalamus, which stimulates more production of oxytocin and release of oxytocin, which targets those myoepithelial cells, which causes them to contract, which releases more breast milk, which causes more suckling, and so on and so on and so on. And that's the positive feedback mechanism of milk letdown. What you're also going to see is you're going to see prolactin spikes occur in prolactin production each time the baby breastfeeds. And so this is going to promote new breast milk production, basically a replacement of the breast milk that the baby is taking in. So as the infant feeds, dopamine release is going to be inhibited by the hypothalamus. And remember, dopamine inhibits prolactin. So if you inhibit the inhibitor, you're going to increase levels of prolactin. So this is going to stimulate large amounts of prolactin secretion. Okay, so let's look at that positive feedback mechanism, and let's start here with the stimulus of the infant suckling. So the infant suckling is going to stimulate those mechanoreceptors in the nipples, and that's going to send a signal to the hypothalamus. Now it's going to send a stimulatory signal to the hypothalamus to produce more oxytocin, which is going to be released from the posterior pituitary, which is then going to go on and stimulate the acini to contract. And what you get is you get acini releasing breast milk as the infant suckles, and then that's going to encourage the infant to suckle more since breast milk's coming out. And that's going to cause this stimulus to happen all over again, and you're going to get the increase in oxytocin, etc., etc. Now, as the infant's suckling, another signal is getting sent to the hypothalamus, and this one is an inhibitory signal. And it's going to tell the hypothalamus to stop releasing dopamine or prolactin inhibiting hormone. And so this is going to result in an increase in the anterior pituitary secreting prolactin, which goes on to target the mammary glands and cause the acini to produce more breast milk. Lactation also inhibits ovulation. We talked about this a little bit when we talked about contraceptive methods. So inhibition of ovulation is going to occur with regular breastfeeding. Gonadotropin releasing hormone release is going to be inhibited from the hypothalamus. And without GnRH, FSH and LH are not going to be released, and so ovulation is not going to happen. Lactation is going to be especially useful in the first 6 months after birth for inhibiting ovulation. It's not going to be a very reliable long-term birth control method, though. And one of the reasons for this is because to prevent ovulation, you need to have regular breastfeeding, okay? The baby basically needs to just be taking in breast milk and needs to be doing it frequently. And that's just not going to remain the case as the infant grows. The infant's going to start taking in other outside foods and is going to eat less frequently. And so all of these things influence the mom's hormone levels and can result in her ovulating again. And then there are these things called after pains, and these are the contractions of the uterus after giving birth. They stimulate the shrinkage of that uterus back to close to pre-pregnancy size. After pains are going to be stimulated by oxytocin, and they're less severe after a week or so, and they're going to be facilitated by breastfeeding. All right, let's switch gears now and talk a little bit about human genetics. So heredity is the transmission of genetic characteristics from parent to child. Genetics is the field of biology studying heredity and transmission patterns. Recall that humans have 23 pairs of chromosomes. Each chromosome is going to contain genes that code for proteins. We display these 23 pairs of chromosomes As a karyotype with chromosome pairs, this is kind of like a map to the human chromosomes, okay? So chromosomes 1 through 22 are autosomal chromosomes or autosomes, and they're going to code for traits that are not sex. Then there's one pair of sex chromosomes that are going to determine genetic sex. There's XX, XY, and then remember there are other variants as well. There are homologous chromosomes. These are paired chromosomes, one from each parent with genes for equivalent biological traits. Okay, so let's say all of the genes that code for hair color are on chromosome 2. Let's just say that. You're going to get one copy of chromosome 2 from your mom and one copy of chromosome 2 from your dad. And so all of that's how you're going to have the genes expressed. You're going to express one gene from mom and one gene from dad. And the chromosome 2 that contains all of those hair traits, hair genes, chromosome 2 from mom and chromosome 2 from dad, those are homologous chromosomes because they have genes for equivalent biological characteristics. I hope that makes sense. Okay, so this is a human karyotype. Think of this as like a picture of a person's chromosomes. So what they do is they take a cell in your body and they take the DNA out of it and they basically line up all the different chromosomes. So here you'll see that you have 22 pairs of autosomes or autosomal chromosomes and one pair of sex chromosomes. This individual in this karyotype is XY. Then let's look at each chromosome. So here's chromosome 1. You get one copy from mom and one copy from dad. These are homologous chromosomes. Here's chromosome 2. Again, one copy from mom, one copy from dad. These are homologous chromosomes. They're going to have the same, they're going to have genes that code for the same kind of characteristics, okay? But there's going to be small differences in each one of those genes, and that's what makes you a unique individual. Okay, a little terminology here. A locus is the three-dimensional place or space where a gene is actually located physically on a chromosome. Alleles, these are variants of a gene. Okay, so let's say you have a gene that codes for eye color. Let's say there's just one gene that codes for eye color. We know that there are more than one gene, but let's say that there's just one gene. You get one copy of that gene or one allele from mom and one copy of that gene or one allele from dad. Okay? Dominant allele. This is going to be the allele that expresses or physically shows the trait. For example, let's say that the brown eye color allele is dominant to the blue eye color allele. So if you inherit blue eye color from mom and brown eye color allele from dad, the dominant allele is going to be the brown eye color allele, and you are going to have brown eyes. That's just an example. That's not exactly how eye color works in real life. Dominant alleles are going to be represented by a capital letter. Then you have recessive alleles. And a recessive trait is a trait that's going to be masked. So it's going to be expressed only if both alleles, both recessive alleles, are present. And the recessive alleles are going to be represented by lowercase letters. Homozygous, an individual is homozygous if they have identical alleles present. So let's say that I inherit the blue eye allele from my mom and the blue eye allele from my dad. I am homozygous for blue eyes. Let's say I inherit the blue eye allele from mom, but the brown eye allele from dad. I would be heterozygous for those alleles. So heterozygous individuals have both the dominant and the recessive allele present. but only the dominant allele is going to be the one expressed. Expression of the recessive allele can appear to skip generations, and this is because its phenotype is going to be masked by the dominant allele, and we'll talk about this in a second about kind of how the math works out with recessive inheritance. Okay, a genotype is the genetic makeup of an individual. That is, what are the actual genes that are there. The phenotype is the physical expression of the individual, of the genotype. So how does it look? What does that genotype, what kind of physical change or expression or trait does that cause in the organism? A Punnett square is a box that's going to show us specific gene combinations resulting from two parents. And it gives us probability that a particular gene combination can occur. Here is a Punnett square, and what it's showing is two heterozygous parents and what the probability of their progeny would be, genetically speaking. So, let's look at it this way. On this side, we have, you see these sperm. This is going to represent the father's genotype, which is capital W, lowercase w. Over here are the oocytes. These represent mom's genotype, which are capital W, lowercase w. Okay, what does this really mean? Well, look at this. This is one of this is a potential allele that mom could contribute to her offspring. Her genotype is capital W, lowercase w, so she can either give the big W allele to her offspring, or she can give the small w allele to her offspring, and it's all just random chance. Same thing with dad over here. So let's just draw out a square, and you draw this cross in the middle of it, and then you look and you write down what you see. So here we have a big W allele and a big W allele. We write that here, capital W, capital W. This is going to be homozygous for the dominant allele, right? The capital letter allele. Homozygous, they're both capital letters, they're both dominant, so you're going to see the dominant trait expressed, which is the widow's peak. Over here, what if mom gives the lowercase allele? What if she gives the recessive copy of the allele while dad gives the dominant copy of the allele? Well, you're going to get the same outcome. You're going to have a heterozygous individual this time. They have a copy of the dominant allele and a copy of the recessive allele. But the dominant allele wins out, so the organism, the progeny, gets the widow's peak. Down here, what if dad gives the recessive allele, but mom gives the dominant allele? Well, same thing, okay? The offspring is going to have a heterozygous genotype, but it's going to display the dominant phenotype, that is the widow's peak. Now, here's where it gets interesting. What if dad contributes the recessive allele and mom contributes the recessive allele? Now you're going to have an individual who is homozygous for the recessive allele. And now you're going to have someone who has a straight hairline, lacks a widow's peak. And this is how a Punnett square works. This is how you draw out a Punnett square. This is the logic behind it, and it's just a graphic representation of what the possible combinations, genetic combinations, could be in the offspring given the known genotypes of the parents. All right, let's talk about patterns of inheritance. We've kind of been touching on that. We've talked about dominant and recessive, and so far we've really just talked about strict dominant recessive inheritance. That's going to be where the dominant gene is always going to win out, and the recessive allele is only going to be expressed in homozygous individuals homozygous for that recessive allele. That's called Mendelian inheritance, after Gregor Mendel, the guy who really, the father of genetics, who did his experimentation with pea plants. And it works in pea plants, but Mendelian inheritance is not very common in humans. Then there's incomplete dominance, and this is going to occur with two heterozygous alleles. So what happens here is the phenotype of an heterozygous individual is going to be somewhere between homozygous dominant and homozygous recessive. So, for example, sickle cell trait. Most people don't have sickle cell disease. Most people have two working functional hemoglobin alleles that code for normal hemoglobin A, and that's these guys, HbA. These are the normal alleles. Some people produce an abnormal allele, HbS. This produces an abnormal hemoglobin, and this abnormal hemoglobin causes red blood cells to sickle, to like kind of curve in, and they become brittle and they break apart and they don't work right. And they clog up small blood vessels in the body, and this causes intense, terrible pain. Sickle cell disease occurs if the person inherits two copies of the abnormal sickle cell allele. Okay, so that's sickle cell disease. However, a heterozygous person is going to have sickle cell trait. So if you have a normal copy of hemoglobin A, but an abnormal copy of the sickle hemoglobin, you have this genotype and you have sickle cell trait. Now, under low oxygen conditions, some of your red blood cells are going to sickle because some of your red blood cells are going to contain that abnormal sickling hemoglobin. Interestingly, individuals with sickle cell trait seem to have an evolutionary advantage against malaria. The malarial parasite invades red blood cells. Among some of the cells that it invades, it has a red blood cell stage. And it is believed that these sickled cells, they are not ideal for the malarial parasite to invade and to reside in. And so having sickle cell trait confers some advantage against malaria. Another pattern of inheritance is codominant inheritance. This happens when two alleles are equally dominant. They're equally expressed in the phenotype. Some traits are even multiple allelic. That is, they have more than two alleles present in the population for a given trait. A good example here of both codominance and multiple alleles is the ABO blood group. Blood types A and blood types B are codominant. So if you inherit an A allele from mom and a B allele from dad, you are going to be AB blood type. There is a third allele though, I, which is recessive. So if you have an II genotype, you're going to have the O blood type. That is, remember, you're going to lack A or B antigens. Then there's polygenic inheritance. This is where multiple genes interact to produce a particular phenotypic trait. These can be genes on the same chromosome or on entirely different chromosomes. And a lot of our traits are going to be polygenic, okay? Eye color, height, skin color, many predispositions to diseases, and expression of these traits can even be influenced by the environment. Now, if you took individuals and looked at their traits, a given trait that has polygenic inheritance, and you put them along a continuum, you would see that that continuum appears as a bell-shaped curve. That is, you'll have a very small proportion of people out here with this genotype, and a very small proportion of people out here with this genotype, and then more people in the middle with the more varied and mixed genotypes, okay? Okay, and then there are sex-linked traits. These are going to be traits that are expressed by genes on the X or the Y chromosomes. Now, the X chromosome contains somewhere between 900 to 1400 genes. Most of those genes are not involved in determining sex. they're actually involved in other functions in the body, okay? They make other proteins for other things. The Y chromosome, on the other hand, has fewer genes, and they're mostly involved for male development. So, sex-linked traits are most often going to involve the X chromosome, because the X chromosome has the genes that are not involved in sex determination. So, more commonly, the X chromosome is going to be involved. Okay, X-linked recessive traits are always going to be expressed in an XY individual because the XY individual has only one X chromosome. So if there's a recessive trait on that X chromosome, it's going to be expressed. The recessive traits are going to be expressed in XX people only if they have two recessive X chromosomes, or alleles, I should say. And that's a pretty low probability of that happening, but it's not a 0% probability. So it does happen. Now, a carrier for a recessive trait is going to be an XX individual who has only one X-linked recessive allele. So they have a dominant allele on their other X chromosome that's going to be expressed. However, they can pass on that recessive allele to their children. Now, if they pass on the recessive allele to a female or an XX child, that child will become a carrier. But if they pass on that recessive X-linked allele to an XY child, that XY child will express the recessive trait. Okay, an example of an X-linked recessive trait is hemophilia A. This is a disorder of blood clotting, and individuals with this disorder are going to bleed profusely after injury. Now, XX individuals are going to be carriers, while the XY individuals are going to be the ones affected. So let's say you have an XX female here, individual here with the genotype capital H, lower h, so dominant allele, recessive allele. She could pass on the dominant allele to the XY individual, and then there would be no problem there, no hemophilia A. But what if she passes on the recessive allele to her XY child? Well, then you're going to get expression of the disease state. You're going to get hemophilia A. All right, another example here is color blindness. This is just essentially the same exact scheme as what we saw with hemophilia A. The XX individual is going to rarely be colorblind because that would require receiving two recessive alleles on the X chromosome, one from mom and one from dad, and that just generally does not happen. It's very rare. It's not impossible, but it's much rarer than XY inheriting the allele and presenting with the disease. Because if XY inherits the recessive X allele, that's the only X chromosome they have. That's the only copy of the gene that they can express. So they will express the disease or the recessive trait. All right, then there are X-linked dominant traits. These are pretty rare. The X-linked dominant traits are going to be expressed in both XY and XX individuals who carry the allele, the dominant allele. Now, affected XY individuals cannot pass on the X-linked dominant allele to their sons because they're not passing on an X to their sons, right? They're passing on their Y. But they do pass it on to 100% of their daughters, because they pass on their X chromosome to their daughters, and it is an X-linked dominant trait. The XY individual is typically going to be more severely affected than the XX individual, and this is because those XX folks have an extra X chromosome, that was a mouthful, that kind of gives them a level of protection against the abnormal recessive X chromosome. Now, many XY zygotes or embryos that have X-linked dominant disorders are just not going to survive through pregnancy. They're going to be spontaneously aborted. Okay, what is penetrance? Well, penetrance is the percentage of the population with a certain genotype that exhibits an expected phenotype. And it's going to be influenced by a variety of factors. For example, hereditary pancreatitis has a penetrance of 80%. That means that 80% of people who have the genotype for hereditary pancreatitis will show symptoms, while 20% of people with that genotype will have none of the symptoms whatsoever. So that would be incomplete penetrance of just 80%.